All right, everyone, welcome to another session of Coding with RV. We are starting a fresh series on Springboard. We are going from the basics, we are learning a lot of stuff, and then we are heading to building complex web applications and REST-based APIs using Springboard. Please do subscribe to the channel to get an update on the later videos, and do join us on this journey. In today's session, we are going to learn about Springboard. We are looking at the basic stuff, what the features are, and then we are learning about REST API and looking about why the combination, the REST API and Spring Boot, are so famous. And then we'll be building a sample REST-based endpoint using Springboard. So let's get started. All right, Spring Boot. So let's look at the features of Spring Boot. What makes Spring so special? So the whole concept of Spring is it wants the developers to focus more on the development part, more on developing their business logic, their core logic, and focus less on the configuration part. So if you remember the olden times where you have to write your bean definitions, your dependency injections, your references, everything in configuration files, everything in XML files, we can say goodbye to all of that stuff with Spring Boot. Like Spring Boot has these starter packages for every function, every feature you want. Like if you want to work on database, Spring Boot has a starter package called Spring Data JPA. If you want to work on the web MVC, Spring Boot has a starter package for that. So all you need to do is add these as a dependency in your build tool, and Spring takes care of all the configurations for you. So that's an added feature that makes developing standalone production grade applications very, very easy with Spring Boot. So this is a feature that most of the companies today, or most of the IT firms today, are looking for. They want to move to microservice architecture. They want to build standalone applications as soon as possible, and Spring Boot makes it super easy and super fast for them. And also Spring Boot comes up with a Tomcat, an embedded Tomcat or an embedded Jetty server. So if you're done with your development, you don't have to build a WAR file anymore. You don't have to deploy it onto an application server anymore. You can just run it right from your IDE as a Java application. And there you go, you'll have the output ready within a few minutes. Now let's look at REST API. So what is REST API? It's an architecture style for building your web services. And why do we need web services? Why can't we just go with a single application? So here's the thing. Like imagine you're building a mobile app. Say for your company, you're building an Apple mobile application. So you have any application has a business logic, a business layer, it has a database layer, and it has all this backend stuff going on. And then you have the front end for your mobile application. So you have built everything. And now the company grows, and then they want to build another application, say for an Android mobile. So now for the Android app, do you think like it's a good idea to build everything all from scratch, everything in the backend, like the database, the business logic, everything from the scratch? Or wouldn't it be cooler if you are able to use the same backend application that you have already developed for your Apple mobile app? And let's say we are adding another parameter. Let's say we are going to build another web application, and we want the same backend logic, but with a different front end. Wouldn't it be easy if the entire backend application was actually a REST-based web service application, and you have your endpoints exposed to all three of these, the mobile app, the Android application, and the web application, and all three can just make calls to this endpoints and consume them? So that's the whole feature, and that's the whole concept of REST-based web services. And that's the whole reason why they are so famous. There are basically 4 HTTP methods that a REST API works with usually. Those are like get, post, put, and delete. Get HTTP method, we usually use this method when we want to request a specific resource from the endpoint. So for example, if you're looking for a student with a particular ID, or maybe an employee with from a particular location, you might use a get HTTP method to make the call. And then we have post. So if you are registering for an application, saying as a new user, you give in a bunch of details and then you submit the application. So this is actually, we are creating an entity. We are defining an entity and we're sending it to the backend to save it to the database. So in such a situation, we would be using a post HTTP method. Then we have put HTTP method that's similar to post. The only difference is if you have an existing entity and you're just trying to update it, that's when we use a put HTTP method. And the thing with put is like if you're trying to update something and maybe you're not finding an entity, you might as well create one. Then as the name says, like delete is the most easy one. Like if you have to delete some entity, if you have to delete a resource, that's when you'll use a delete HTTP method. And then we have query params versus path params. Actually, I'll get into the application. Let's start doing some coding, and then I'll get back to the query params versus the path params. Okay, so let's get started with the practicals. So we are trying to build a Spring Boot application. So what better than go to google.com and start looking for Spring Initializer website. Spring Initializer is kind of a build tool that Spring Boot provides. Like here you can pick all your configurations. Like if you have a build tool like maybe Maven or maybe Gradle, you can make a selection here. Then for language, I'll be using Java today, and for Spring Boot, I'll leave the default configuration. And here, if you see, you can give your group ID, your artifact ID, your name, description, package. Yeah, let's start by giving the group ID com.rv, and let's give the project a name. Say, let's call it sample Spring REST API. And then we can pick the packaging. Let's use war packaging, and I'll use Java 8 version. And here's the main thing, we need to add some dependencies. So these are the starter packages Spring Boot provides. So today to develop a REST API, let's use web, the Spring Boot web starter package. And once we are done with all these selections, let's just download let's just click on generate button and download the zip file. So if you see here, it gave us a zip file downloaded. It goes to the download folder. Just extract the file, the contents, and move the package to your workspace. Right, I think we are all done with the settings. Let's just move to Eclipse. All right, we are here in Eclipse. Let's just import our project. To do so, we'll click on File, Import, and then we'll select Maven here and existing Maven projects. Browse to the location where we just copied the folder and click on Open. So if you see here, once you made this selection, Eclipse automatically detects that there is a pom.xml file. That's the Maven build configuration file. Let's click on Finish and see here at the bottom, it's importing a lot of stuff, building and downloading a lot of stuff. Okay, just expand the project and let's open pom.xml. So pom.xml is the configuration file which says, which tells Maven what the project is, what are the dependencies we need to download. So here, if you look at the group ID, the artifact ID, packaging, everything that we have selected on Spring Initializer website gets copied over here. Even the Java version gets copied here. And if you look at the dependencies, we have the Spring Boot starter package for web that we selected is moved over here. Okay, that's about the configuration. Let's move on to Java application. So here's the Java code. So since we are working on Spring Boot, let me introduce you to the most important annotation in a Spring Boot application, the Spring Boot application annotation. This is actually a group of multiple annotations. Like if you see, it says Spring Boot configuration, enable auto configuration, component scan, and a bunch of other stuff. So what just declaring this single annotation, we are actually telling the Spring container that this application is a Spring Boot application. Let's enable the auto configuration. So auto configuration is like if you are using a Spring Boot starter package in the dependency. It does all the configuration required for a particular application based on the class path or the dependencies that we are selecting. Then let's look at the component scan annotation. So component scan is something we are telling Spring container, saying this is the location, or this is the folder, this is the package where you need to scan for your bean definitions and for your bean dependencies. Okay, this is about the annotations. Let's look at this class. So this class over here is the heart of a Spring Boot application. So all your execution starts happening here. Right, let's get started. Let's create a new class. Since we are going to define our REST endpoint, let's create a REST controller. Let's name it Spring REST controller. I'll generate commands and then finish. Okay, so this is our REST controller. Okay, since we're calling it a REST controller, let's use the annotation REST controller, and let Spring know that this is a REST controller that we're defining. Okay, there you go. And then let's create an endpoint method. Let's call it a get endpoint. Let's use get mapping for that, get mapping annotation for that. And let's define a URL, say hello mapper. Okay, I'll define a method, and I'll have string as the return type. Call the method as hello mapper. And since I'm saying I'll return a string, just return a string hello Spring. Alright, I think we are done with all the settings. We have defined a REST controller, we have defined a REST endpoint, the URL, and we are returning a string. Let's just run. Okay, let's just run the application and see if it's working. Okay, to do so, we just need to go back to our main application class, right click, and run as a Java application. So if you see, this triggered this to be run as a Spring Boot application, and if you see, there's a Tomcat embedded server that the application is being deployed to on the port number 8080. Okay, let's go to Postman. So this is how a Postman looks. So Postman is a tool we use to test our REST endpoints. You can just download it online, and these are the different HTTP methods that a Postman supports. This is a get endpoint, so let's use get and type in the URL http localhost 8080, and let's use the URL. Let's look at the URL that we defined. Okay, we are saying hello mapper. Just copy it over there, paste it, hello mapper, and see if it works. And there you go, hello Spring. So whatever we are returning there is being returned as a response here, and this is our first REST endpoint. Now let's go back to the slides. So if you remember, there was something called query params and path params. So how many of you have noticed a URL when you're working on some applications? Say for example, you're looking at a Google search, the main thing that we do every day. So if you're doing a Google search, have you ever noticed that right after the URL, there's a question mark and there is a bunch of stuff that's being returned to the server? So these bunch of values that we are returning to the server are actually query params. So if you have multiple query params, we just use an ampersand sign and then we keep passing it. And let's look at what path params are. Path params, on the other hand, if you have looked at some applications, you might see that there's a URL and then there's slash and then there are a bunch of values that are being returned. So these are nothing but path params. So when do you need to use query params versus when do you need to use path params? So for example, if you're doing some filtering or if you're doing some sort, like you want to sort your results or do some pass some filter options back to the server, that's when we use query params. And for path params, like if you have to pick in a request for a specific resource from the server, for example, if you want a student with a particular ID or an employee with a particular location from a particular location, you use path params in that situation. So let's get back to our application and see how we can request query params from the endpoint. So in order to request for query params, the annotation that we're going to use is called request params. Then we need to define the value. We define, say for example, we are trying to accept a first name. Then we need to map it to the local variable. Let's map it to the local variable first name. And once I have the first name, I will just return it. Actually, let's create a template. For instance, let's say a string template hello and then %s. And here in the return statement, what I'll do is I'll do a string.format and I'll use the template, and let's just pass first name as the parameter over here. Let's just save it and restart the application. Okay, let's go to Postman and see if this works. All right, since the URL now expects parameters, this doesn't. Okay, let's try to pass in a parameter, question mark first name equal to, let's call it spring, and send the request. All right, here you see spring, hello spring, and don't worry about the error. It's just like we're sending a plain text back. We don't need the single quotes over here, just remove them, run it again, and there you see hello spring. Okay, what if we need two query params? What if we want to pass two query params? Let's see, let's use another request param. Let's call this one as last name, and create a local variable for this last name. And here we might need another %s, and here in the params we might need last name. We just need to pass last name. Okay, that's fine. Let's save it and restart. Okay, let's go back to Postman and see. Okay, let's use an ampersand and then say last name equal to world and send. All right, here you see hello spring world. Okay, this was about query params, but let's also see how we can define a get endpoint and accept path params. So let's create another method called hello path mapper, and the annotation, let's define get mapping and give it a URL hello path mapper. Okay, so if you see here, path params are actually part of your URL, so you have to include them up here in the URL. So you say first name and last name in the curly braces, and here the annotation to define the params, it's called path variable. And let's give it a name, first name, define a local variable's first name, and let's have another one, path variable. Define the value as last name. Let's have a local variable called last name. And here we can just copy this code over here because we are not doing much of a change in the business. We're just using a template, string template format, and send it back as a response. We just defined a new URL hello path mapper. We defined the first name, last name as the path variables. Okay, let's see if this works. Restart the server. Get back to Postman, and let's see, this is a get call for hello localhost 8080 and hello path mapper. Let's pass the first name as Spring and last name as world 2, and let's see if it works. So yeah, it's a get HTTP method, so just see if it works. And there you go, hello Spring world 2. So this worked as well. So we have seen the difference between query params and path params. We have seen how to define URL endpoints for each of them and how to return a response in each case. So that was about it today, guys. Like, we have discussed the basics of Springboard, we have discussed what a REST API is, and we have discussed how to define our endpoints, our first endpoints using GET protocol. That's about it, guys. Thank you for watching the video. Like, if you like the video, please like and share, and also hit the subscribe button for the later tutorials. And if you have any queries for me, please do leave your messages in the comment section below. Thank you so much. See you guys again.